quiet then.
All right, friends. So thank you all for being here. Good crowd today. This is wonderful. We continue in our study of From Widows to Warriors. We are on the second chapter now. And so as you've guessed, we've just taken a chapter at a time. As I shared last week, our pattern in this book will be to read a chapter, and then there's oftentimes multiple characters introduced in a given chapter. For example, I think this week there's 4 or 5. We will focus on 1 or 2 each class time. So the handout is usually available in advance. So if you want to know who we're going to be focusing on, it'll be in the handout. But there's some really good stuff that's also in other parts of the chapter. It's just too much for us to cover in one class setting, I think, without having enough to kind of dive deeper on the individual characters. We'll go ahead and open with the word of prayer. So let's pray together. Holy God, we're grateful for the gift of this day and this opportunity to gather together, to continue to study your word, to lift up stories, often from characters who we've not paid attention to be aware of where your spirit led and where your spirit is leading us. We pray all this in your son's name. Amen. So the chapter that we're on, chapter 2, is the women who kept Moses alive. And obviously, in the Old Testament, which is what this study is focusing on, the women of the Old Testament, Moses is a huge character, right? I mean, we have the whole story of Exodus and the deliverance, and the part of what's being lifted up is here is there are some women who played a key role in keeping Moses alive to get him to the point where he might be able to do these wonderful things of helping liberate the people, God's people, right? And leading God's people. So she lifts up a couple different women for us to pay attention to. The 2 that we're going to be focusing on today are the women who kept Moses alive. And I'm sorry. Yes. So women of the Exodus is the study. Is this chapter. The women we're going to focus on today is the women who kept Moses alive and Miriam. Okay. The other 2 that are lifted up in this chapter are Zipporah and the daughters of Zelophehad, which is a pretty fun one to read if you haven't read that little section there in this chapter. I invite you to do that. So we're going to look at the women who kept Moses alive and Miriam. I'm going to pass around these pages with some artwork, and this is kind of our introduction, our sharing. I don't have enough for everyone to have one, so if you are here with a neighbor or someone that you tolerate, if you could share with your neighbor, that'd be great.
Somebody told people to we're on the camera.
So there's a variety of different artworks from different cultures here, capturing some of the stories that we're encountering today. And so it's a front and back kind of setup. And so I invite you just to take a look at some of these pictures. And I'll invite us here in just a moment to, we have an abundance. You like each other. That's wonderful. Does anyone want to have their own copy so you can see it a little bit better? Okay, Chuck, you can just put those there with you. We'll capture them at the end. So take a look at the photos. And this is a kind of question to the group. This is kind of our introductory piece. I wonder if there are images here that capture your attention or things of note that you might lift up. So you see at the top larger photo that has the woman who's just given birth with the 2 women attending to her. That is a painting that captures the very first story we're talking about, the women who kept Moses alive, the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. That's also them in the image below there. The next one down would be those who are in power in Egypt, who rescued Egypt and kept Moses alive. Right? If you flip it over, the same scene is being captured there. Moses being rescued from the river. The smaller one next to it, I presume that's Miriam and her mother putting baby Moses in the basket. And then we have the image of Miriam and the other women of Israel dancing celebration when they crossed the sea, Red Sea. Anything that stands out to you as you look at these images?
I like the different style of art.
Yeah.
The Asian painter.
The image with Marion and the tambourines, that's the image I had when I read the story.
Yeah, okay.
Which one's that?
The one of Miriam and the women dancing at the end is
This one, that one at the top, above that, on the right, looks like, honestly, goodness, I should have said, the chat GPT picture. That's
Oh,
what
it looks
you have
almost
that
like a-
on.
yeah.
That's on
Yeah.
one, and that looks like what's the pic.
What strikes me as the tenderness in each of these things. And the idea that the Pharaoh would order the women to kill babies.
Mhm.
It's
no wonder that it didn't work, right? Yeah.
Exactly. What were you thinking?
Yeah.
It's like the compassion and tenderness for each other and the baby.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Other observations or notes?
To me, there's a strength in all these women.
Mhm.
You can feel it, you can almost, you can see it in every one of them. I especially like the bottom one, this one, where
Mhm.
the arms almost look so masculine and strength.
Yeah.
I love that. Hands.
Any other comments?
That's with me.
Good. Well, this is just meant to be kind of an introduction into these texts. We're gonna take a look here. The first one, the first group of women that we'll look at is the women who kept Moses alive. And so I'll read to us from Exodus. This is the first chapter, verses 15 through 22. And then we're going to take some time. We have a really big group here today, which is fantastic. We're going to split into some smaller groups for some conversation about both of these passages. So that will be our pattern today. Okay, so we'll read this together here. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and allowed the boys to live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. So the questions I'd like for you all to kind of discuss in your smaller group will be these exploratory questions that she raises for each passage. How is God being generous? How is God bringing shalom? How does God redeem human brokenness? How does God work through human beings to bring about God's purposes? So you don't have to answer all four. If there's one that jumps out at you that you have a quick response to, you can do that. Then we'll come back together. If there's any insights we want to share with one another, we'll do that. We'll follow through the diving deeper section and might have some opportunities for some continued conversation in your small group. And then we'll move on to the story of Miriam. Okay, so these exploratory questions, we're not going to spend a lengthy amount of time there, but just kind of some initial conversations. So we will do the six of you, if that works. Is that okay? The six of you as a group. The six of you as a group, you can kind of circle up if you want. We'll go the six of you as a group. This works well. The seven of you. If your group feels too big, you can split into stuff. So you're just looking at these exploratory questions to start with, okay? So, what's that?
Are you out there?
Feel too big? Okay, so let's start.
I don't know how.
Fine.
Barbara, you're the only one online, so I'm not able to mix you with somebody online, so I apologize. But we'll continue some insights.
God. I think some of us are that same. Serving God, not the Lord. But the power of them is just, and then they just lost their dad. Yeah, and they just like, why, oh, that's why he's treating the women. Those people would think about that because he's treating the women were. Yeah, and worry about it. It's like so, it's very, very, you know, it's a.
Well, in terms of the four questions, anyone of the four strike you as significant comes around?
Surprised, I never read it.
Sorry.
That is being gracious by a way. I think that's what.
I go to Germany.
And obviously, there's anybody's help, yes.
Now, and the word shalom.
One of the simplest was hands God working. To bring about God's purpose.
And so when you look at that, how's God bringing it back?
That's why we're.
Whole work to the women, well-being in the store.
I guess it's when families were.
Yeah.
That's their children.
Yeah.
And it's a few times.
How about the action of the midwife?
I'm not really sure.
They are taking big risks. Very big risks.
They didn't get in trouble. They lied.
No, they did. God protected them. Somebody protected them.
But they lied in the favor.
How did the Hebrews get to Egypt the first Yeah, there was. There was a time where food was rare. And they had a. Time where no crops. Egypt had it. So they went down there with Joseph, unbeknownst to them, make sure they got down there to survive. So it was a means of survival from the ground to get down. That's what. They did fall into that. That was one of the things that always gets them in trouble.
But I mean, that's part of his.
And they did that because I think that as they were, the myth, the highs has failed. Yeah, and they were.
These women were always God's did. They say the family is the different. Prophet. They say no, it's very different. Yeah. And just like. They're not.
Friends, let's take about another 2 minutes to wrap up your conversation. You'll have more time in these groups to wrap up.
And that last one, how does God work for human beings to bring about God's purpose?
Like Mary, when God said you were going to behold the Gabriel, he said, okay, but you look at all the prophets, Jeremiah, Jonah, all of them.
He uses the midwives to save the children, save the babies. And it's sort of interesting whether they were conscious of it. The midwives were serving God's purpose. And how often does that often happen? We do something not with God's purpose in mind, but it ends up Yeah, you look back on it and go,
Midwives with the Hebrews,
oh,
whoever,
how that happened?
if it- they wanted to be-
And whether we realize it or not, we are.
All right, friends, let's draw our attention back to the larger group. Are there any insights that you all would like to lift up from your group's conversations regarding these 4 questions? Anything that jumps out at you? Well, I'll share one that I heard, overheard. Over in this group over here, one of the last things they were talking about was how does God work through human beings to bring about God's purpose? And rightly, they were lifting up how the midwives, and Chuck was speaking about how the midwives are serving in this way to bring about God's purposes. But Chuck's question, I think, was a good one, which was how often does it work like that in our world? Come on in, welcome.
Hi.
Hey there, glad you're here. One of the that we oftentimes aren't even aware of us fulfilling God's purposes. We're just doing what we think is right. And how often did the midwives know that they were being agents of God's love and God's mercy in that fulfilling God's purpose, or were they just doing what they thought was right? You know, so oftentimes God's purposes are fulfilled by human beings in ways that we aren't even really tracking, right? Any other? Yes.
Both.
Yes.
My comment was similar, is that God empowers, even in an evil system, God empowers people to find a way to subvert the evil of that system.
Thank you. Yeah.
And whether the midwives were Hebrew or Egyptian, I had never thought to question that, the author did. I said,
Yeah.
yeah. Again, what do you think we do that from?
Yeah, yeah. So, so I want to just kind of move through the diving deeper section there, and lift up a few of the points that she makes and leave you with some questions as well. And then we're going to move on. I want to spend a good bit of time on Miriam, so I want to kind of keep us moving. So in the diving deeper section, she lifts up this idea of ruthless, how ruthless and brutal Pharaoh was, you know, in this command to kill babies, right? First asking the midwives to do it, and then just saying to kind of declaring that any Hebrew male shall be thrown into the river, right? And so she's talking a little bit about how people and institutions with power often spend a lot of energy to maintain the power that they have, right? And she lifts up how the gospel enables people to let go of that power that they hold on so tightly to. And so kind of questioning us to kind of consider that and reflect on that. She lifts up the fact that the midwives did not do as Pharaoh commanded, right? And so she raises some questions to say, what does it mean to speak the truth when the truth means death and the lie means life? So what does that mean about telling the truth or lying, you know, in this kind of very gray area here of things, right? Does God demand a legalistic truth telling when lives are at stake? Or does God care more about justice, compassion, and saving lives? So she raises some good questions there. Call the midwife is the next little point she makes. And she's talking about how the midwife can be a very powerful image for us to think about when we think about God. Not one that we probably have in our kind of vocabulary as we think about God, but the purpose of the midwife was not to take away the pain of childbirth or to do the hard work, right? But to be present and supportive and active and encouraging in the midst of struggle and pain. So lifts up kind of this image of God as midwife. It might be a helpful one for those who are going through some kind of struggle. And the last one she lifts up is the helpers. And she brings in that bit from Mr. Rogers, right? As the question of when there's tragedy or when there's some kind of calamity, look for the helpers. Those are the folks who are helping other people or running towards the area of crisis, right? And so she says, identifying the helpers in our lives is a way to identify examples of grace and care and compassion. It enables us to see the ways that God is working in our lives in surprising ways through surprising people. And then the question that you're all left to kind of consider is, who was a supportive, encouraging friend who kept you going when you wanted to quit? Who was a wise person who gave you good advice? Who stood up for herself or others and taught you to do the same? So in other words, who have been helpers in your lives as you think about times where life has been challenging? The questions for further reflection are ones that I will leave for you all to take home as your kind of your homework, right? The Hebrew midwives engaged in a form of civil disobedience. I heard this group down here talking a little bit about kind of pushing back on things, right? Form of civil disobedience, choosing to follow the laws of God rather than those of flawed human rulers like Pharaoh. Can you think of situations in our society that would lead you to consider similar small acts of disobedience?
Don't even get started.
And I would challenge you to think not only what are the situations, because I think that's probably the easy one. That's the easy question. Think that what are the situations? How might you respond? What might be those small acts of disobedience that you might consider that might be in response to seeing a flawed rule rather than that of God's laws, right? The second one is the author challenges us to identify the helpers in times of trouble or difficulty. Are there times when someone looking for the helpers would have seen you? So to your own kind of reflection about when you maybe have been a helper to others. So the earlier question, think about the helpers in your life. When have you had an opportunity to be a helper in the lives of others? Okay, so that's kind of a quick run through of the women who kept Moses alive. And she lifts up both the midwives who we focus on, but also Moses's two mothers, right? His own mother who puts him in the basket, and then his Egyptian mother as well. We're going to hear part of that story as we dive into Miriam's story. Just a quick question. What do we know about Miriam's story in Exodus? What do you all know about Miriam? If you've read this book, you've got a little bit more about Miriam, but for those of you who haven't, or maybe as you think about before you read this book, any thoughts about Miriam?
Before I read this, I had no thoughts.
No thoughts. Didn't even register. Yeah. Any others? I think that's a very fair response, Scott. I think a lot of us probably thought Miriam who? Oh yeah, she's somehow related to Moses, right? Or in that story, right? So we get a little bit more about Miriam here. So I'll read the Exodus 2, 1 through 10. I wonder if I've got a volunteer who might read Exodus 15, 19 through 21. Thank you. And someone who might be willing to read Numbers 12 through verse 9. Very bad. And then do I have someone who would read us 10 to the end, 10 through 16 of Numbers 12 there. Thank you, Renee. Okay, so I'll read this first one. So this is telling us a little bit more about Miriam's story. So a reading from Exodus 2, 1 through 10. Now, a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. This must be one of the Hebrews' children, she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water."
So
Yes, it's
when the horses of Pharaoh with his chariots and his chariot drivers went into the sea, the Lord brought back the waters of the sea upon them. But the Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground. Then the prophet Miriam, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and with dancing. And Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, and he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider, he is thrown into the sea."
Numbers 12. While they were at Hazeroth, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had indeed married a Cushite woman. And they said, "Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also?" And the Lord heard it. Now the man Moses was very humble, more so than anyone else on the face of the earth. Suddenly the Lord said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, come out, you three, to the tent of meeting. So the three of them came out. Then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forward. And he said, hear my words. When there are prophets among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly, not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed.
When the cloud went away from over the tent, Miriam's skin had become diseased, as white as snow. And Aaron turned toward Miriam and saw that she was diseased. Then Aaron said to Moses, oh my Lord, do not punish us for a sin that we have so foolishly committed. Do not let her be like one stillborn, whose flesh is half consumed when it comes out of its mother's womb. And Moses cried to the Lord, saying, oh God, please heal her. But the Lord said to Moses, if her father had but spit in her face, would she not bear the shame for 7 days? Let her be shut off from the camp for 7 days, and after that she may be brought in again. So Miriam was shut out of the camp for 7 days, and the people did not set out on the march until Miriam had been brought in again. After that, the people set out to Hadrach and camped in the wilderness of Moses.
The word of the Lord. Thank
Thank you, God.
Thank you, readers. So here we have the story of Miriam, right? Miriam is Moses' sister, and we encounter her in the story. She's not named in this early story from Exodus, but most folks assume that this is Miriam who's there to help not only watch over her brother, but kind of puts this idea to Pharaoh's daughter, like, hey, can I go get a nursemaid for you? And not only does the mother get to then nurse the child, but is also paid for that, right? So a blessing that comes out of this awful situation. But then we move forward into Exodus 15 at the escape from Egypt. And Miriam is there with tambourine in hand and is dancing. And this is Miriam's song that we hear, sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously, horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. And so that image that we looked at the beginning of the women there with the tambourines, right, capturing that scene. And then we jump forward further as they are, Israelites are wandering around, and we hear of this kind of moment in Numbers 12 where Miriam and Aaron, who are brother and sister, are kind of, have been kind of Moses' right hand and left hand. And so they're kind of questioning we've done a lot of stuff here, right? Has the Lord only spoken through Moses? What about us? There's a little bit of jealousy, maybe. I mean, we could read out into however we might. And then the Lord kind of calls them to task. And we see that who is punished with leprosy? Aaron. What happens to Aaron? Nothing. Yeah. Okay. So she's lifting this up, and she's right to ask some questions about why is Miriam struck with leprosy and Aaron is not, when they both seem to be the ones questioning, right? With leprosy, she is cast out for 7 days. But it's interesting too that the people did not go anywhere until she was able to return to them, and then they moved on from there. So I want you all to have some time for some of the deeper reflection questions here. So just kind of going into the diving deeper, some of the quotes from her text I wanted to highlight for you all there about being silenced. It is not enough simply to say that God hears the voices of the marginalized. The church, society, corporate world, and other institutions and structures need to be more intentional about listening to women, not just upper middle class women with MBAs, but all women. What they say may not be easy to hear, but there will be truth and gospel when those in power choose to lean in and listen. There's so much silence about Miriam, and what the text does say can be disconcerting. When women leaders are so rare, it is difficult to acknowledge their imperfections, but preachers do not do the women in the Bible any favors by downplaying their flaws. Like the male characters, they are human. They make mistakes. They should not be more harshly criticized when they fail, and they should not be excused. So the questions that I'd like for you to have a little more time as you talk as a group are these three questions there. What were Miriam's strengths and flaws, and how do you see the relationship between those two? Had you been Miriam, what would you have said to God when you were struck with leprosy? And I would add to that, and Aaron was not. What other groups can you think of that we need to lean in and listen to hear truth and gospel, and how might we do this? Okay, so that's kind of the movement of the three questions. So I'll invite you again to have those conversations in your group. We've had some new folks join us, which is awesome. So Michael, if you would join this group right here of 6, so if you all could include him, and I'll have you join this group right over here to your right. Okay, all right. So if you all want to break into those groups and dive into those questions.
I'm not gonna, I think they're. Yes, did you agree?
Okay, Miriam's strengths, Miriam's flaws.
It's a condition or situation. To go find one or find a nurse aide from his residence. She was strong enough like a secret job. He's going to go to the first distance. I guess you only had to get the same way. I get it. I mean. Yeah.
First problem. He couldn't get on.
Brother.
Aaron's a brother.
Yeah. No.
Had a response to
I remember when Moses said, I can't speak.
Yeah.
His brother.
It reminded me of
Very
to elected.
Now, I thought it's a brilliant plan, whether she had it ahead of time or not, but to say, oh, by the way, somebody that hurt this kid. I said, just. And, you know, the amazing thing is that she gets the mother to nurse her child for probably 2 years or so. And she gets pregnant. Brilliant movie. Brilliant. There's a lot of interesting. She is in. And you can try. Hey, I'm not even tired of that. How about the flaw?
He could not talk to me anymore.
Well, I think she was outspoken. That's the problem.
Yeah, the questioning of leadership. And
That would be Mary and Aaron.
you wonder, it doesn't tell you in the text, what was your problem? What's going on? And I often think, was she influenced by Aaron to join in the fight or not? And you don't know. It doesn't really say. It just says they can fight. God got mad. Now, if you are the writer of this story, why does Marion get the consequences and not Aaron?
Called Change America. And what Change America.
If you're not on to question two, I would invite you to move on to question two.
You don't see him anyway.
But if you do with attention, that's really. If you go for this, what you're gonna do is you're gonna be. You're gonna be just in this- and it's like, you're gonna like- Which I'm not understanding. I'm not- If we're to do somebody else, you're saying, well, I didn't want you to- or they give us all the whole negative attention.
If you're on question two, if you haven't already, move on to question two.
What would you have said to God? I said, what about him?
Yeah, yes, I don't know anything about.
You guys like the more deep.
I mean, what can we?
That's all about him. Father, that's
I'll take that. And then I think it's cool that the whole camp. So obviously they expect. So obviously it's going to be bigger. And then all the men, it kind of reminded me of that. You know, you had to show stick in the guard. Really? Takes two to tango.
All right, we'll move you to the third question. If you're not there already, please, let's spend our last few minutes on the third question, then we'll draw our thoughts together again. So third question, head there. That's not silent. You keep talking. I'm pushing you to the third question, so we make sure we have time for it. Yeah.
That's something that's the third about.
What other groups?
Yeah.
Yeah, what are the groups or individuals you think of that we need to leave?
I would say homeless and foster.
It was well organized, really, there were people.
A month, enough like us. That we think that they could be the biggest, less time. They're not from your story. And maybe there's something that I'm saying.
Homeless, anybody who's poverty, those who are struggling with hunger. And actually, those folks who have diseases and illness tend to be isolated. And you never have a chance to be out
sometimes very organized.
Communicate with people. Yeah. Going into the hospitals and visiting people, that kind of thing. Particularly for those who have chronic diseases.
I would, as a
Or just a few.
lawyer, I would say the incarcerated people have been changed in their lives. And it's like, yeah, so-
There's a lot of handshakes that I say that.
Anything.
It's. Okay. My older brother. College, blah, 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 blah. I didn't have it. We got kind of homophobic, we think, we racist. And that's just in my opinion, that's wrong. That's just thing. So I don't know. We have to be like. If I know.
All right, friends, take a minute or so to wrap up your conversations and we'll draw our attention back to one another.
I just think this thing about Moses, he says, I know it's not here, but when he says he's faithful in all my house, I'm like, Moses. And that's my danger, like, oh, okay, like, when things get perfect, it's like, so it seems like God is able to put some blindness sometimes, and it's just.
I recall that
And that's just that Gemini said.
All right, friends, let's draw our attention back to the larger group here as we approach the end of our time together. Were there insights that you would like to share with one another, particularly in response to question 3? Groups that we might, who are often silenced or overlooked, that we might be benefited by from listening to hear the truth that they might lift up for us. You're pointing towards.
I represent people that are accused of crimes and are being incarcerated. People often are forgotten. And I hear a lot of people in my work that say they've fallen in love with Jesus. And sometimes you have to take that with some circumspection. But the people that have discovered Jesus and are incarcerated and are spreading the gospel in prisons and then get out and really change their lives, they have a lot to share, a lot of wisdom from their trauma and their experiences. And I've seen some people become true leaders. One of my clients had a split sentence for a pretty bad sex offense. And now he helps in the community that he's in on probation, help sex offenders find places to live, because it's very difficult to find a place to live after you've been accused of a crime like that. And literally there are all these rules and you can really housing's fine, but you don't have restrictions. It's hard to find now. So I just think people like that really do make an effort to change and have some wisdom.
Thank you. Other responses that you lift up from particularly that question 3?
One of the things that I said was Epstein's victims. I mean, there's all this hoopla about, who is involved and we need to have the files and whatever. And the people that were victims of this are right there. They're speaking out and they're being ignored. I mean, that they should be what's in the being put forward the most.
So oftentimes victims are overlooked.
Right.
Or blame.
Or blamed.
Yeah.
Any other responses?
I think, spirit of our conversation was listening is very important to different groups and very difficult. For me, it's the famous so what question of all of this. Therefore, so what?
Yeah.
How do we change our lives and relationships based on this narrative? And I don't have an answer. I'm one of the things. This nation is so divided. I've made some attempts in personal conversation to say someone on the other side. Tell me what's at stake for them. What do you, what's motivates you? And those are tough things. Easier one-on-one.
Sure.
Yeah,
Thank you. Very,
I think our section was, what can we do? You know, I found there's some things that we can do, you know, there might not be big, but they're just little steps that we can take. And for me, there's been a lot of fear in doing those steps, but I think sometimes you have to step outside the fear and go for it.
thank you for sharing.
This is so off topic in a way, but I just heard on the TV the other day that called what is the show, The Midwives? Called The Midwives. There's a new season.
Okay. So if you're a fan of it, call the midwife. It is a new season. So this
One of the things I think you have to remember is that midwives were not just the sole practitioner, they were healers. So they had a very broad spectrum of natural health and a very holistic kind of medicine where you went. Of men and women, not just women.
Sure.
I think one thing you could do is show up at both.
Right. That's number one, it's priority.
Yeah, that's one thing that you can do. And I was looking at the results of the last presidential election, and there were a lot of people who did not vote. That made a heck of a difference. This guy won by 1.5%, which is nothing.
So, this chapter of the Women of the Exodus really lifts up some stories that focus on how some of these characters have been overlooked or even silenced, or despite their flaws, are used for God's purposes, or despite their kind of lower status or whoever they might be, could be used for God's purposes. And I think, kind of going back to the thing that Chuck said at the beginning, how, you know, it's an invitation for us to consider how we might be used for God's purposes as well, right? I'll share this final quote as we get ready to part ways. Miriam, Aaron, and Moses, and the rest of us are flawed and complex people. Sometimes we sing joyfully, and then we get testy with each other. Sometimes we are courageous. Sometimes we don't want to be leaders anymore. Sometimes we are confident, and then we are terrified. Sometimes we demonstrate great spiritual maturity and insight, and then we don't. But the amazing thing is that God uses Miriam and Aaron and Moses with all their gifts and all their flaws. And God uses us with all our gifts and all our flaws for the good of the kingdom. So parting questions for you all to consider, which is kind of her fun ones, the imaginative questions. How might things have been different? How might have been different if Aaron was the one who got leprosy and not Miriam? Or they both got leprosy. You know, it's kind of fun, just kind of imaginative question. How might things have been different? Who could have intervened to change the course of action? Where might grace have been found? Let's go ahead and close with the word of prayer. Next week, we'll be looking at women of the promised land, and Sarah will be teaching next week. So thank you, Sarah. And let's pray together. Merciful God, we are mindful of these stories that sometimes get overlooked, of characters who played important roles in bringing about your work, bringing about your kingdom, of guiding and leading your people. Lord, help us to be attentive to those characters in the Bible, to be attentive of those folks in our very lives, for those who are responding to your call to love, to bring about your word and to carry forth the message of your gospel. Lord, strengthen us to be courageous in how we respond. In your name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, John.
So glad you're back on.